166 First Avenue, Manhattan, Monday, February 17th, 1998, 10:38 p.m. The dry chill tonight was pregnant with snow, lingering with the embedded glittering of gray Manhattan sidewalks and visible breath. In the midst of the dot-com thunder that everyone on Wall Street was getting drunk on, tonight's distraction from the tedium was Izzy Bar, a Lower East Side dive, a basement that was ground zero for a musical proving ground, a byproduct of the computer craze called drum and bass. The muted beats and harmonies that leaked outside were masked within the vastly larger confusion, the city. Ever since the synthesizer began to conquer pop, the direction music was taking during the late 90s was a natural symptom of the dot-com boom reverberating outside the small club, across the larger, impossibly complex multicultural chaos and deep-seated chiaroscuro halls of power extending globally from Wall Street. The near-capacity crowd tonight was mostly Japanese, corporate, but enough for a small conversation. For a moment, the mental flavor could have been written by William Gibson. I walked through the door, a sweet, toxic funk of obsession still lingering a day after I'd succumbed to a sleepy-eyed Japanese siren named Kiyomi in her room at the Soho Grand, one of many lovesick infatuations that had reverberated like echoes since that breakthrough at the Chelsea. I took a vodka cranberry from the bar that only had room adjacent to the stage. The New York crowd walla always seemed to pull me back from becoming the war correspondent I thought I was supposed to be. I was only 16 when I took on an internship at Magnum. Then in my freshman year at Syracuse University, I embedded myself with ROTC field training exercises, and the black and whites made it into the Black Star Agency library. In a financially imposed year off, I decided to explore and took a crack at covering the native Hawaiian protests against the geothermal plant violating sacred land. It was not the career step forward I hoped it would be, and tonight I was fighting the fact that there was nothing left to those efforts except the end of my first and only marriage. The agencies couldn't sell the native Hawaiian clashes with geothermal power interests on any kind of empathetic spin, even with the Haole environmentalist protesters who had joined in. Journalism had begun to fossilize as the industry was being reconfigured to favor agencies over staff, with sustainability already eroding under the digital takeover. For worse, those early ambitions were now superseded by the independent filmmaking buzz that had gripped New York, the fear of missing out on the market that sent Quentin Tarantino's career into orbit. There was also a lot on the stove that has since rather metastasized into some of the moronic insanity that we're seeing today, fed by the proliferation of digital communication technology. The 1990s truth movement was already sending a new wave of conspiracy theories pouring into the freshly minted corridors of the internet. The bullshit meter was put to the test like never before. kicked into high gear by everything from white supremacist ideologies to Ashtar Command or Old Testament Ashtaroth, flying saucer-infused versions of ancient cults. Hollywood managed to have a ball with them, though. Chris Carter bought the very first copy of Alex Constantine's Psychic Dictatorship in the USA, lots of it historically accurate research into the Nazi origins of U.S. classified research that gave us mind control and military-funded flying saucers. More hard corruption researchers like Rodney Stitch fell out of favor, while the juicier stuff was soaked up by big entertainment. I talked to a few whistleblowers myself, some of them killed. Alberto Rivera, who was poisoned. Bill Cooper, shot at his home by a deputy serving a warrant. While others stayed off the radar while their work was turned into fiction by the Sci-Fi Channel, such as Alex Constantine, or plot lines in B-movies, like Stitch, with only one based on true events, that Barry Seal movie with Tom Cruise, that reframed CIA criminality as a comedy adventure, finally writing it off in the public mind. But it all started with a high school elective class in communication, for which we had to write an essay each week. We were immersed in the likes of Tony Schwartz's The Responsive Chord, Paul Václavic's How Real is Real, and Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. Brave New World and 1984 were just appetizers. One chapter in Václavic touched on spy communications networks during World War II. I'd seen No Way Out with Kevin Costner, and at this stage I'd already met Sean Young through a schoolmate whose mother taught Sean's dance class on the Upper East Side at American Dance Machine. On that grand spiral staircase leading up to the studio, she gave us the skinny on how the movie was originally supposed to end, but didn't because the executives didn't think Deckard as a replicant would sell. And so it wasn't much of a Machiavellian stretch for me to decide to pick up the phone and call the Central Intelligence Agency and explain my high school assignment to them. They offered to send me the CIA career brochure. Not even considering the reaction of my father, a civil rights journalist turned documentary TV star at ABC News, at receiving the manila envelope with Central Intelligence Agency printed on the return. I hurriedly shepherded the new mail back to my room and tore it open, and put aside the high strangeness that they had a brochure that I was now leafing through. Reading through, it openly described the 5-step process of gathering information to help policymakers make better decisions. One of the steps was called data reduction, and was described as the step in which people involved had the opportunity to greatly influence policymaker decisions by deciding what they would see and wouldn't see. This inevitably triggered a no-way-out scenario of a KGB-infiltrated CIA, and the story basically wrote itself and became the catalyst for research that oftentimes felt like it was oscillating between fiction and reality. In college at Syracuse, the story was still fresh, and over my first summer break, I related to Carolyn Hill, one of 2 girls I was sharing an apartment with on the Lower East Side on Ludlow Street, just up the block from Max Fish, and all the fun going on there that I would only learn about years later.
Oh my God, that sounds a lot like the Illuminati.
She gasped. The what? I said. It was all new to me as she pulled together anecdotes like a scenario in Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49, the Freemasons, Robert Anton Wilson, and that a friend of her father's who was in the CIA had a lot to say about them. It was thus that the KGB became the Illuminati, probably best incarnated a decade later as Agent Smith and his chums in The Matrix. While wanting to make the story more realistic, my curiosity just to find out what the hell was going on could find no cure. A quick visit at my high school where the story began, which had not yet closed for summer break, yielded a mention by the communications class instructor that our own headmaster, Charles W. Cook, who'd fought in World War II with former Secretary of State George Shultz, was a Freemason, and that there was a Masonic library and museum down on 23rd and 7th. How come I had never heard of this before? So I paid them a visit, and fingering through the card catalog in the library, there were several references under the subject Illuminati, including a book called Conspiracy Against God and Man, which I pulled from the shelf. There was a strange book depicting George Washington wearing royal clothing and holding a scepter. An elderly Mason in a suit noticed me with the conspiracy book and assuredly told me, "That's just a bunch of nonsense." "Sure," I said, nodding my head before going back to the contents. Getting back to Syracuse, I did another search and dug up a charge to the grand juries of Pennsylvania in 1799 by Alexander Addison, declaring that the Masons were infiltrated by what he called Jacobin-allied secret societies, and that, he said, the world was to become one Mason lodge. I'd only scratched the surface of what was quickly becoming a persistent cloud that blurred my peace of mind. And then JFK hit the theaters, and it started to build meat on the historical framework. The research that fed into my own story eventually zeroed in on the mind control sector. Julianne McKinney, now deceased, headed the Association of National Security Alumni. We'd had a couple of conversations on the phone about what she called the UFO myth, in which she referenced the role of children and cult communities in abduction scenarios, used for continued medical research since it will be otherwise illegal under a non-classified setting. She eventually referred me to Blanche Chavesty, a rights activist who had managed to squeeze 10,000 pages from an 8-year Freedom of Information Act request for the CIA's MK-Ultra documents. She passed them to me on 4 CDs, which I promptly shared with Cryptome.org, and MKUltra has since been on the internet for all to see. I'd also confirmed the research of Rodney Stitch on my own. Stitch asserted CIA connections with Hawaii law firm Bishop, Baldwin, Rewald, Dillingham, and Wong, and also Hill and Knowlton, a PR firm. I independently verified that a local Honolulu TV reporter who broke the story on the law firm's CIA connections, Barbara Tanabe, ended up joining Hill and Knowlton, as well as the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations Local Outreach Committee in Hawaii, which was being illegally administrated with taxpayer money in the governor's office, where I managed to score a membership list. Not only was the governor also a member, but the heads of every major bank, 2 former CIA officers, and the heads of the major news media. Stitch had sources who corroborated claims elsewhere that Bush Sr.'s Zapata Oil was the first of many offshore oil operations that used their normal helicopter crew conveyances to smuggle cocaine into the U.S. to finance black ops that Congress would never have approved funding for. Military hardware suppliers and anyone else involved could have laid it out. In World War II, operating in Romania, Greece, and Yugoslavia, as well as formerly occupied caves and vaults in German-occupied territories. Project National Interest got Nazi intelligence officers out before the end of the war to use in the eventual fight against the Soviets. In Italy, 1948, we stole the elections. France, in 1949, we broke the strikes. The CIA was involved in the removal of Quirino in the Philippines, turning the 1953 elections to Magsaysay. In 1954 in Guatemala, we removed Arbenz by a military coup. In 1953 in Iran, there was Operation Ajax, a counter-coup which removed Mohammad Mossadegh. Then in 1954, there was involvement in Vietnam, 1958 in Indonesia, and in 1959 in Tibet, getting the Dalai Lama out. The Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba was being set up for October in 1962, but got canceled, and in September of 1963, Kennedy was fleshing out a plan to get the U.S. out of Vietnam, and Diem was assassinated a mere 2 weeks before Kennedy. After JFK was assassinated, the challenge was to put an entire population to sleep and acquiesce to an official story no matter how much it contradicted basic research. Control of the media was, and still is, essential, making sure that people are just too preoccupied with too many distractions to care. Economic, psychologically crippling entertainment, infiltrating and abusing faith in institutions and controlling people in key positions through compromat, so that when the official story comes from those institutions, the public is confused and too hesitant to make any real difference. War is the organizing principle in any society, and so the corporations are needed as well. Interests are integrated to the point that the survival of a society cannot be trusted without war. And so it went. Stitch also wrote about a planned 1993 assassination of Bill Clinton in San Francisco that also involved a Mossad agent named Anna Colburn, real name Yossi Jamir. Also involved was a 333 Bush Street law firm called Heller, Ehrman, White, and McAuliffe, a guy named Bach Pan, who was allegedly buried in a hill, a Napa winery owner, Greg Verfethen, who financed the operation, and Joanne Stanhope of the Republican Party, and finally a guy named Chan Wang, who was in an organization called the Eagles, and who ran a company called EIC in Redwood City, California. When I asked about Stitch's claims that he'd been involved with a planned assassination of Bill Clinton, Wang never denied involvement. He only wanted to know the name of the writer of the book that mentioned all this, Stitch's book, Defrauding America, and Stitch never got sued for perjury or defamation. But I kept going, uncovering annual OSINT conferences happening in Herndon, Virginia, led by Robert David Steele Vivas, a former clandestine operator who defined spying as drinking with Russians. I discovered Steele's treatise on OSINT, claiming that he could fulfill the intelligence requirements of the entire U.S. Marine Corps for $20,000 a year through subscriptions to open sources and gray access services such as LexisNexis, Meet Data Central, Thomson Reuters, the Society of Competitive Intelligence Professionals, or SCIP, the Congressional Research Service, Helen Burwell, Sina Sharp, Aero Bureau, Teltec. The avalanche of the unknown drew me further in as the intelligence world began to appear even more accessible, and so I ended up attending one of Steele's summer conferences. I hadn't been back in D.C. since elementary school, but I recognized the mental flavor of the place, now with the enhanced perspective of seeing the actual Masonic Lodge on the way to my bed and breakfast. After sitting in the waiting room, where I encountered a printed edition of The Onion for the first time, it was finally time to make my approach. After walking through the entrance of the Rosslyn Hotel and entering the conference registration, I met, among others, the head of Austrian intelligence, 4 mostly blonde officials from the Norwegian Self-Defense Forces, and the lead staff advisor for integrated intelligence systems at the MITRE Corporation. Of all I'd learned, I was finally able to put some reality to the screenplay, while I couldn't help wondering if, in fact, there was a career in there for me somewhere. But it was just too much of a foreign concept to consider. Although we'd stayed in touch, I'd kept my contact with Steele at a minimum. Having wallowed in this mire for several years, it was impossible to not go forward and write a treatment. I was sure that I was going to cash in. This led to all those subsequent meetings all over Manhattan. The actress's agent who said she could get the script to Gus Van Sant, Eiko Ishioka, who got the Oscar for Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then there was Dov Simmons, whose classes on cassette gave Quentin Tarantino the wherewithal to forge Reservoir Dogs. Simmons hosted my date and me for Christmas dinner at Tavern on the Green with his own Japanese girlfriend. There were multiple industry connects and relays sweeping me into the city's natural, buzzing, booming flow of deal-making. But unfortunately, still a green novice in the film world, I'd overshot the going rate for spec writing by an unknown. A friend from Phoenix rolled into town with 2 lovely platinum-wigged dancers he had formed a band with called Area 51. And I offered to let them crash at my Jersey City living room so that they could play a show at Mercury Lounge across the Hudson River in Manhattan one night. When their electric drum set failed to connect, another musician who was there that same night, Tony Verderosa, came to the rescue and solved the relatively minor technical issue. My appreciation for the new music was nurtured by a vocalist who had shared the stage with Tony that initial night at Mercury Lounge, Trixie, a.k.a. Trudy Reese, who was gracious enough to walk me through the highlights of electronica, as I had approached her with the idea to incorporate something of what I'd been hearing into this new film I was writing. With a view looking out over Chinatown and Trudy's post-party-ridden living room, populated with tastefully eccentric furniture by large panoramic windows, she forwarded me into the likes of Goldie, Moby, and Aphex Twin, finally swirling into mixtapes and CDs of LTJ Bookum's Logical Progression and Toate's Sweet Robots Against the Machine, while Trudy herself was already working on Coming Back, her contribution to the Crystal Method's highly consequential Vegas album. And tonight, Tony was also on the bill at Izzy Bar. Tony, a heavy-set goateed Italian cross between Satan and Telly Savalas, introduced me to his friend named Al, a young writer who offered to introduce me to Abel Ferrara, who was then busy filming the Christopher Walken-Willem Dafoe adaptation of William Gibson's New Rose Hotel. Warnings were circulating that Abel was still in the throes of heroin addiction and wasn't the best guy to be around sometimes. Visiting the set, I don't know how they fit so many people and equipment into that tiny space where they were filming. It was a dark nightclub bathroom setting, and Abel started screaming at the crew. He called for a couple of Asian hookers to be part of the scenery. One of them, Kimmy, was taking a bath when she picked up her cell phone and was glad to play the part, rushing downtown in a taxi to the set, hair still wet in time for makeup. By the time she arrived, Willem Dafoe had intercepted her as Abel was flying off the handle. Abel walked off the set, leaving the writer to take the reins until the dust settled. "Just hang back for a bit," Willem said. The weird timing, though, was such that Al introduced me to actor Joe Vitarelli, whose trailer ended up parked directly in front of my home in Jersey City one day during the shooting of Analyze This. As Joe, wearing a napkin over his tie, took on a plate of spaghetti, I asked if he could get my script to Charlie Sheen, who he said he'd known since Charlie was... Joe just trailed off and held his hand about 3 feet above the floor. Still, I overshot the going rate for a first-time writer by $1 million. Like, literally $1 million. Joe just nodded and finished the spaghetti. My connection with the Japanese legend Gakuryu Ishii, or Sogo Ishii, the godfather of Japanese cyberpunk, was shot down after a fee agreement by fax caught the eye and the ire of Ishii's New York-based co-production agent, who felt left out of the deal. Before the plans crumbled, I was already in Tokyo, invited by a big-boned, half-Russian, half-Japanese importer of Japanese porno manga, supplementing her income from a position at Manhattan's Kinokuniya bookstore. At a blues bar at 2:30 a.m., I traded drinks and later granted her company in my airport hotel room with Juka, a deep-voiced beauty with close-cropped hair, who turned out to have had a small part in Ishii's Angel Dust, as well as being married to the jazz trumpet player who played the police chief in the film. Angel Dust was the reason I dove into the film world. It was a long way from the okonomiyaki and beer dinners I'd shared with Japanese NYU film students in a noisy dive on 8th Street. Some called it Japanese Harlem back then. One of those students personally knew Ishii and the Japanese filmmaking community in Manhattan. All of it had begun with an actor, a friend of a former love in Brooklyn, the first girl I wanted to marry. I was at Izzy Bar tonight with some of those friends made along the way. My Japanese contingent was comprised of that NYU film school student who connected me with Ishii-san, their mutual actor friend who bore the catchphrase branding of a Japanese David Cassidy, and the actor's other two friends, a biotech engineer and his wife, the both of them absolutely thrilled to be out of their apartment. But I was there tonight mostly because the latest experimental futuristic foray into computer-assisted music on Manhattan's Lower East Side was a really terrific distraction from the one-bedroom railroad apartment I now occupied alone in Jersey City, other than a couple of wooden bar stools that were once part of the set on Donnie Brasco. There wasn't much there to keep me company. The body heat and humidity grew with the crowd. the controlled glows affording just the right amount of civilized respect for personal space, and highly prized moments of introspection, just about perfect for someone who used the camera as a coping mechanism and distancing device. The condensation from iced gin and tonics, Manhattans, and ice waters leaking into cocktail napkins shared comfortable distances with plastic stirrers, all drenched in Kubrick-like commercial ambient lighting from the glowing surface of the back corner table. This coveted perch of the remastered basement anchored its own share of conversations underneath the added electric flickering of a projector screen, a resized slice of Times Square, layering the wall with anime cartoon clips of a space-age, white armor-clad, blue-haired nymph dodging lasers and explosions. Testament to his eventual nom de guerre as a musical John Henry, Jojo Meyer played by hand what only sounded like computer-generated rhythm. Were it not for the outward proof of work made plainly visible by the blurred movements of his wrist, hand, and wooden drumstick, one could easily be fooled into thinking the beats were born of mere programming. Meyer had set up shop with his band down there, a scene they called Prohibited Beats with a Z, a weekly bill with regulars like Yamaha's DJ drummer Vedrosa. Once Tony got his electric set off the cozy stage, a 21st century Josephine Baker named Elisa Burchett in black faux Persian lamb fur took the stage in front of a lone microphone. Her voice flowed like sensitive ripples across soft spring water around the swirling beats and bass engineered live on a laptop, its cold clinical light revealing the face of a platinum-haired Swiss 50-something named Heinrich Swallen. As Heinrich gingerly bobbed his head to the beat while maintaining keyboard precision with a cold placidity, Eliza's methodic, syrupy voice was barely a shade from the relentless finesse of Nicolette Love Sueton's presence, which gave Massive Attack's 3 all its allure. When Eliza descended from the stage down to my level, I muttered some manner of praise, as unfortunately there was no rose to give. She invited me to a couple of Meatpacking District after-hours retreats for the stratospheric jet set called Nels and Mother. Places that swam in that thick finesse that dripped all over you like honey while listening to Massive Attack's Protection album. 2 parts seductive mystery with a dash of exclusivity set in chiaroscuro. If I wasn't so goddamn traumatized from the divorce and possessing an aversion to the vampire set, I might have tagged along. Sitting in a taxi speeding down 7th to the Christopher Street Path Station, the relief was that getting back to Jersey City was the right thing to do on a night before another early day at work. After waiting underground for about 10 minutes, all the stagnant electrical smells gave way to the dusty breeze of the last train as it finally arrived. A newspaper gently settled nearby after the wind, headlines blabbing something Chinese espionage, North Korean nuclear missiles. By 1999, I was still trying to edge my way out of the aftermath of the would-be relationship with the supermodel. She handled the frustration better than I would have. After one big on-screen moment with Keanu Reeves and Al Pacino, failed to get her any subsequent roles. My successive lineup of temp positions allowed me the chance to cut into New York's independent film frenzy, finally writing and directing my own La Jetée-styled 20-minute film, How I Met the Model, the Female Lead. But almost on cue, the fireworks of romance, which literally started when we finished shooting on July the 4th, eventually fizzled into the sobering reality that finally, there was nothing real left to show for it all. Every successive girlfriend attempt was a disastrous band-aid for the last. I sat at the small window in her well-kept, minimalist, Arvad almond-carpeted second-floor one-bedroom apartment in Gramercy Park, staring at Julia Roberts' unmistakable red bob of hair making its way down the sidewalk outside. And just for one more moment, I forgot about how difficult life was becoming. A week later, I'd moved out, but finally had to endure the indignity of seeing her photo in the Hennessy ad, plastered all over the city, seductively applying lipstick with another model in a mirror. Brooklyn Bodega coffee was a staple in Williamsburg, It went especially well with the street wall mixing with the regular rumbling of the J train, making regular stops at Marcy Avenue, just outside the tall windows. I looked down into the street below, staying caffeinated, letting the morning ideas pop and germinate. The echoes of New York City fit perfectly into the 1,700 square foot studio that I managed with the 6 other guys. We'd sometimes rent it out for students and independent filmmakers for $50 a day, while we stayed up on the second floor, where we'd sectioned off our own spaces like some kind of bohemian barracks. I walked down the stairs one of those times and said hello to Mae Wen, the alien opera singer from The Fifth Element. Once again, I looked at the newspaper headlines, now folded and fading into irrelevance, now sitting on the windowsill. The more I went out into the world and traveled, the less respect I had for headlines. I encountered Michael Douglas on West End Avenue, a block from our brownstone on 98th Street. He looked drained as he plodded towards the camera, in character for a fatal attraction. It was also where I'd received the CIA career brochure. In our rented apartment, the square black shine-finished coffee table positioned in the living room was a monolithic anchor point of conversation between the dark green sofa and gray comfy armchair facing out the glass sliding doors to the patio, where possibilities multiplied. Arguments flared, revelations resonated, and decisions were finally set in stone. It was there that the idea for a European vacation dawned, as the first time I'd ever be out of the United States. And so, by summer, we set out to London first and settled into a homey house in Oxford. The university, London sights, Blenheim Palace, and other excursions came and went, until we connected with my stepmother's family in Germany, in Cologne. As a culture-shocked 15-year-old already missing Friday nights with Miami Vice and the energy of Manhattan, I got paired with my 16-year-old cousin Anna one day for a trip around the city. She made her disposition clear. Closely cropped black hair, black tank top, army green dungarees, and worn black boots, the most she felt like showing of her punk influences in hot summer weather. If Nana and her 99 red balloons weren't so popular to the point of cringe, Anna probably wouldn't have hated her so much. We strode through the responsibly clean Messedeutz metro station. As we sat in the air conditioning on the train, Anna quietly muttered something profound. The bullet-scarred cathedral we had just visited, the only structure left standing after Allied bombing just 40 years before, the clear absence of male senior citizens on the train, was a more subtle but at least equally sobering reminder that war is indeed a real thing. We at least could share our mutual anxiety about growing up under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. What was keeping us from the brink? It was only one of several symptoms of growing up during the Cold War, which could not be seen directly, but the indicators were all over. A few weeks later, while treading water in a swimming pool at a family mountain retreat near Trier, a Bitburg F-14 Tomcat performed a close flyover. Trier was the last stop before taking the train to Belgium to meet my parents at the ferry to Dover to head back to London Heathrow. But my father, an award-winning renowned journalist in his own right, had vowed to make the most of the trip, and took a whole day to make sure I'd been exposed to Berlin. My father's own reputation as a globe-trotting journalist was rather well complemented by a natural resemblance somewhere between Marcello Mastroianni, James Garner, and, when annoyed, the deadly eye glint of Roger Moore's Bond in The Spy Who Loved Me, my first Bond film, which my father took me to see in Atlanta in the summer of 1977. Late-night recounts in the living room of his excursions to Cairo and Tel Aviv, writing about the 1967 and 1973 Arab-Israeli conflict, suddenly made sense to me when watching the pyramids fight scene in the theater. By the time we were in Berlin, Dad's incursion into television journalism had now reached new heights with the networks, so today's Cold War field trip was little more than a matter of due diligence to get his son up to speed as to the ways of the real world we lived in. The abundance of graffiti on the western side of the wall, in contrast to the barren east, was the first thing to hit. The photography bug was still biting down pretty hard, fed by Rolling Stone magazine and the high school library back in Manhattan. The seemingly infinite possibilities afforded by photography were a powerful solvent for the chaotic animal call of adolescence. The camera was a tool to make sense of the world that came alive so viscerally in 1980s New York City. With the healthy incubation afforded by a Manhattan prep school, it was a lot easier to absorb and amalgamate the work of Herb Ritz, Annie Leibovitz, and Bruce Weber, sometimes enhanced with a Philip Glass or This Mortal Coil soundtrack, matching brutal slow-motion elegance with very fine-grained black and white visuals. Now in Berlin, those newfound cultural foibles were the rope from drowning in the unfamiliar, the insecurity of a 15-year-old boy out of the country for the first time. Stepping out of the green Volvo taxi with Dad to walk along the western side of the Berlin Wall was a rite of passage, because seeing the reality left me forever scarred with a sense of how uncertain, incomplete, and narrow-focused the news could be. No spies were visible that day, despite the presence of armed guards occupying the towers lining the eastern side, where not even a single defiant atom of color was afforded asylum, while on the western side, every manner of paint and graffiti was given free rein. The American soldiers on jeeps mounted with M60s peered through binoculars at the East German soldiers peering back at them. I noticed one of them leaning out of a guard tower window, so I grabbed my Minolta SRT SC2, a Christmas hand-me-down from a stepsister, hanging on my right shoulder by its deep blue heavy cotton strap. I pulled the East German into focus. My 50mm lens didn't afford much of a close-up so much as another verifiable reminder that I'd been there, and that the East German was also photographing me. The paranoia was real. What people read about, the Cold War, was real. But the experience of the reality was not printable, and thus fell to the reader or listener to realize. My next Cold War experience was 2 years later, where I took a 10-day socio-political tour, again sponsored by Dad, an investment in my apparent future as a photojournalist. I think he realized he now had to continue the incubation he had started in Berlin, with many a father and son conversation along the way, even though this time I was going it alone. While again, compared to the experience, conventional journalism just fell short. As the box minivan rolled north in the midday sun, on the palm tree-peppered coastal highway from Leon to Corinto, I had snapped photos of anti-aircraft batteries visible on the coast from one of the minivan's tall, spacious windows. Stopping in town to wait for a resupply of gas in the midst of a war-inflicted fuel shortage, I wandered into a shipyard, following almost the exact same path of actions that got me in trouble 2 years earlier in Augusta, Georgia. Incurably curious and inspired by Man Ray at age 14, the drive to be an artist demanded that my 74-year-old grandfather stop his tan Ford Granada so I could get out and wander into the scrap metal yard. Creative vision, however, soon met head-on with the barrel of a dusty .45 caliber pistol. An ignorant, power-tripping, dirty white t-shirt-clad, beer-bellied scrap metal yard owner decided it was a good idea to point his gun at a scrawny 14-year-old, demanding the film. He also decided it was a good idea to point his gun at my grandfather, in spite of best intentions to smooth out the situation. Although we were forced to leave empty-handed without the film, I managed to smooth-talk the grease-laden Yahoo into giving the film back, braving a re-entry to the scene of the original trauma, making it all the way to the grungy office and back again with the prize, now developed and printed intact. Now, testing fate again inside the Nicaraguan shipyard, I noticed a Soviet hammer and sickle on a short smokestack, and the weapons and other military supplies stacked high on pallets. Miles away in the capital, the Sandinistas were engaged in peace talks with the Organization of American States. I didn't raise the camera to my face, but looked down to approximate focus and exposure, and began clicking, winding the film forward. When I turned to leave, it was impossible to weave away from the AK-47 toting Sandinista soldier, now approaching, demanding papers. In spite of recurring pain from an anxiety-induced stomach ulcer, the group's tour guide eventually found me sitting in the waiting room at Corinto Sandinista headquarters. Unintimidated by pro-Lenin posters glaring from the walls, the tour guide used his own 2-year history with the Sandinista army to run interference, speaking with the commander to negotiate my release. I also had to sacrifice a fresh roll of triacs from one of the 16 or so pockets in my Banana Republic photojournalist vest in order to distract from the roll still and the camera, which contained the incriminating evidence. By the time I nervously strode out to return to the tour van and its exasperated fellow travelers, I'd managed to salvage the coveted set of shots of the anti-aircraft guns in the Soviet ship. Back in New York, some of them got published in El Diario La Prensa.